There we go.
Okay, I'm going to do a 3, 2, 1 countdown, then I'll start, just in case the editor wants to edit the thing afterwards.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. Well, thank you for this opportunity to present on probably one of the hottest business topics around for some time, and that is the Protection of Personal Information Act. This webinar comes to you because so many businesses right now are trying to figure out what should they be doing in the final rundown to the commencement of the enforcement powers, which are in the hands of the Information Regulator South Africa. Those of us with an understanding of a little history of the POPIA Act will know that the lead up has been significant. Back in 2013 was when we first saw the legislation come onto the statute book, and since then there have been a number of developments. Back in 2016, we heard about the appointment of the information regulator, who started to make moves almost immediately, suggesting that the POPIA Act would soon be in so-called commencement mode, meaning that we'd all have to pay attention and comply. We then went into a little lull from 2016 until 2018, when we saw the issue of regulations associated with how the POPIA Act would be implemented in practice. And then during last year, the momentum seemed to build again until in June, there was an announcement that the POPIA Act would now be coming into force with effect from the 1st of July, 2020. But as already foreseen in the planning phase for implementation of the legislation, in fact, in the legislation itself, that meant that we were starting a transition period. And that transition period was the final notice to organizations who fall within the scope of the applicability of the Act, get their act together. And that started a 12-month countdown. We're now in the last part of that 12-month countdown. And hence the focus on understanding what is the POPIA Act and what do I need to do about it. And that's really the focus that we have in the webinar today. So I'm going to share with you some ideas, and a little later we're going to be dealing with your ideas and your comments, and I'll tell you how we're going to do that. So 2 main topics that we're covering in this webinar: Protection of Personal Information Act. A preferred short name from the regulator is POPIA. I've heard it called POPIA, but the POPIA Act, what do I need to know? Then the second main topic is, what do I need to do about it? And we'll have the Q&A session, which will be your opportunity to provide some input. I want to give you a notice right now that we're ready to take your chat questions at any time during the webinar. So please use your chat box to submit any questions, queries, comments, feedback that you have. And when the presentation session, which is going to last roughly 30 minutes, has been completed, we'll turn to answering your questions in the Q&A session. So please submit those questions, queries, comments at any time during the presentation, and we'll tackle those during the Q&A later. And here we go with the content of the presentation. 10 things I need to know. What are those 10 things I need to know? Well, first, as I've mentioned, the POPIA Act is now coming into force. There's been some confusion over what does it mean to have the POPIA Act but not have the POPIA Act, to be sort of halfway in between. Over the last, nearly a year now, many of the organizations I've been working with have already been coming under pressure, but not pressure from the information regulator. Regulator has been a little bit bound by the transition period of 12 months, but that hasn't stopped other parties saying, wait a minute, you should be complying with the POPIA Act already. Wait a minute, are we confused? Is the POPIA Act in force or isn't it? Well, it is enforced in the legal sense that it's on the statute book, it has fully commenced, but the enforcement powers of the regulator were suspended for that 12-month transition period. So some of you may already have been receiving communication from some of your interested stakeholders asking, what are you doing about complying with the POPIA Act? And I've heard it said before that the regulator represents a big threat, and the regulator is going to come down with a big heavy hammer, and I'm going to get in trouble with the regulator. And quite frankly, I think that we need to respect the role that the regulator plays, but recognize that the information regulator is not the only party that's going to take an interest in what our organizations, if I use that term in general sense, what our organizations are doing. So whether we're running a small or large commercial organization, we're running a not-for-profit, we're in the public sector, any of the three spheres of government, all those organizations need to understand that the regulator will have those enforcement powers from the 1st of July. Now, that's just a month away, and that's a pretty tight timetable if we haven't done work already on getting to understand what is the POPI Act and what do I need to do about it. Hence the focus in this webinar. I'm trying to give you some practical advice, but before we get down the practical advice route, we need to have an idea of, well, what is this beast that I'm trying to do? As with most things today, you can go to the web and go and key in words such as POPI Act, and bingo, up will pop a number of links. But one of the most useful things to do is key in Information Regulator South Africa and go straight to the Department of Justice website, where you'll find the, I'll abbreviate it to IRSA, where you'll find the RSA profile, and usefully, the regulator has published there a number of documents. And clearly, it's useful to have copies of legislation, but also a number of guidance notes. And those have been coming out thick and fast over the last 12 months or so. So there's lots of information that's on hand, very conveniently, if you go to the Information Regulator website. Now, what is this POPI Act all about? We know it's about protecting personal information, but surely there has to be some detail that we can get our hands around. One of the points that I think is worth emphasizing is the fact that we're joining the international community in terms of data protection or information protection, and some of that terminology can be a little confusing. Internationally, the term personal data is used more often. In South Africa, we have the personal information definition and the processing of personal information widely used in the legislation. But at the same time, we talk in the legislation, and some of that relates to not only the POPI Act, but related legislation, Promotion of Access to Information Act, or POPIA, which has been around for 20 years or so now. We talk about the data subject. So you could say that at times the terminology is interchangeable between data and information. It's also useful to think about some of the principles on which this type of legislation is based, but the term principle is not used in the legislation. So be wary of jumping to the conclusion that something called a principle and go looking for it in the legislation. You won't find it. What you will find is 8 conditions. And those conditions for lawful processing give us an outline of what the expectations are built into the legislation. And remember that I've mentioned there have been steps made since 2013, when the Act was passed, to enhance the basic requirements that we find in the POPI Act. Those requirements in the Act have been expanded in terms of further action taken by the regulator, including issuing draft and then final regulations, and a number of guidance notes, which take the form of practical advice on procedures around working towards an understanding compliance with the POPI Act. Basic building blocks here are that we need to understand the 8 conditions for lawful processing. And those conditions apply to a responsible party. And the first things we have to do is figure out whether our organization is a responsible party. The definition in the Act says it is the individual or organization that determines the purpose and means of processing. Now, you might say, well, isn't that a bit restrictive, having only one purpose for processing? Of course, if you read and interpret the Act more clearly, you may well have more than one purpose in mind when you're collecting and storing and updating and distributing and eventually destroying or erasing the information. Over that entire life cycle, there are likely to be a number of purposes. But what the POPI Act is saying that you must have, as an organization, as a responsible party, one or more valid purposes for obtaining and then further processing the information. Now, the means of processing the information may be varied. Those means may be measures that are taken by the responsible party within the organization to work with, process personal information. But it may also be that there are other parties involved. Those parties may be service providers who further enable the responsible party. The terminology used in the Act is that an organization that provides information processing on behalf of a responsible party, an operator, can be part of that bigger, if you like, ecosystem of what the responsible party is. The responsible party, of course, may well be an organization, large or small, that has direct employees of their own that form part of the whole responsible party environment, may include other individuals and organizations working under the instructions of the responsible party. So the key thing to understand is, what are those 8 conditions? What do I need to do about those 8 conditions? We'll understand in minutes or a little later in the presentation. So it's also important to understand that even though there are 8 conditions, including things such as accountability and quality of information, security, respecting data subject rights, we're not trying to turn this into a legalistic presentation this morning. We just want to get some of the ideas about things I need to know, so you can go and explore further all the detail around those 8 conditions. Please remember that the POPIA Act is built in such a way that it's not only about the 8 conditions. The 8 conditions are to do with lawful processing by a responsible party, but there are a number of other requirements that have to be met that are in the Act but are outside of the 8 conditions. Now, some of those other requirements include international, not only best practice, but international legislation, which is emanating from way back when we first had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in the 1940s. Since then, international legislation has recognized special or sensitive personal information. And we need to understand what the rules are in terms of what is defined as special personal information and what needs to be done about the way we process that special personal information. So SPI for short, a little less of a mouthful. SPI would cover things like criminal record, medical history, trade union membership, religious views. These are defined in the legislation, in POPIA, and we need to understand whether or not we're processing, we're holding, we're storing, we're distributing, we're updating, we're eventually deleting or erasing special personal information, because there are further restrictions involved. Now, that special personal information can also include, and broadly include, children. They come into a category all of their own. And in the POPIA Act, the definition of a child is somebody who's under the age of 18. When looking at special personal information as one of the other multiple requirements, we certainly need to think about whether or not we're in the type of organization that's heavily involved in processing information of children. It's easy to see that that might come to education, healthcare, a number of other areas. So now we've spoken in principle about the responsibilities of the responsible party in terms of the means and processing of information, but the detail associated with that is that if you look at security safeguards, condition number 7 of the POPIA Act, it's made clear there that we must complete risk assessments for all reasonably foreseeable internal and external risks. In addition, we see in section 109 of the Act, when the regulator is going to be assessing the degree of administrative fines for non-compliance with the Act, that the regulator will take into account whether risk assessments have been completed and the extent to which an organization is executing or conducting what is called good policies and practices and procedures. So it's not enough just to do a risk assessment. We need to make sure that we have a remedial action plan, we monitor our ongoing risks, we look at our risk management effectiveness. And as if that wasn't enough, the POPIA regulations, they were launched in draft form and then later finalized back in 2018. So the regulations have been around for some time. Also lay a requirement that we should conduct impact assessments. Some people have been a little bit confused by this because risk management as a whole looks at the probability of a risk event and the impact of a risk event. What's interesting to notice is that although there's very little definition in the regulations as to what an impact assessment might look like, this is a common international practice, particularly when it comes to looking at the approach used in the European Union, back in 2016, announced its own updated data privacy, data protection legislation called the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, makes impact assessment, or data protection impact assessments, a mandatory component of complying with that international legislation. It's very clearly laid out in the European legislation what is meant by an impact assessment and how. Some organizations are looking for international best practice to adopt, to adapt in the POPI environment. And it may well be that some of the one-liners we see, such as the reference to the impact assessment, which has been in the POPI regulations for some time, is an area that we'll see further explanation, further meat on the bone, if you like, coming from our local regulator to explain exactly what they think the impact assessment should look like. So the fifth point is, again, something that comes from the regulations. You won't find it in the original POPI Act. You have to turn to the regulations, a copy of which is available on the regulator's website. That states that the responsible party must develop, implement, and maintain, of other words in there, but the spirit is we must have and we must maintain a compliance framework. Now, there's also been some debate as to what we mean by a compliance framework. Is having a policy enough? Is having a group of policies enough? And again, if we look to the sort of international movement, the direction, which, by the way, in the legislation, in the POPI Act, says there's an expectation that we should be constantly looking at international best practice. And the regulator, Panzi Klakula, and her team have spent some time over the last several years. And I have to say, COVID, but traveling around, and since then, hosting visitors. We had the Data Protection Commissioner from Mauritius here in South Africa, quite recently, has looked at some international benchmark as what's involved in terms of effective data protection. So although there's some debate as to what a compliance framework might look like, part because there's no real explanation, no definition of that in the POPI regulations or elsewhere, many organizations are looking to international best practice. And thankfully, there are several good examples of what that compliance framework might look like. In particular, there's ISO standards that we can turn to. Some organizations have been using ISO standards in the area of information security management systems, ISO 27000 series, there are multiple standards, using that as a start towards their compliance framework. But there are other standards in the ISO series, in particular ISO 29100, which is a privacy framework which could easily be, and certainly working with many of my clients, has been a popular choice to adopt that international standard and explain how it can be used as a compliance framework in the South African environment to help to address the problem. If you're a subscriber, like I am, to one of the professional bodies, then the International Association of Privacy Professionals, which is worth exploring more for the robustness of how they approach privacy on a global basis. That international professional body offers a framework for privacy management, which includes privacy governance, program governance, and the privacy operational lifecycle. That's yet another example of how you can look to international best practice for a compliance framework. There's no requirement in the regulation that an organization must adopt international practice, not at all. It's entirely feasible that you may, in your own organization, develop your own compliance framework. But what is important is that, as the regulations now say, that it's the duty of the information officer to develop, implement, and so on the compliance framework, that is a topic that you must give attention to. And early on in your efforts to get ready for POPI compliance, it's worth exploring what is meant by a compliance framework and how are we going to demonstrate that in our organization. One of the things which has been on the cards for some time is to register your information officer. Now, we know that legislation says by default, the chief executive officer or equivalent title, depending on the nature of the organization you're in. So in the public sector, for example, we wouldn't normally see the term CEO, but in a national government department, the most obvious person to do that would be the general equivalent terms. That information officer must be registered with the regulator, and the date has moved several times. Currently, the cutoff date is the 31st of July. Now, back in April this year, there was a guidance note with associated documentation published by the information regulator suggesting that there were two ways to register, two primary ways to do that. Number one, fill in a form which was published back in April and to submit that to an email address. Very quickly, I think the regulator learned that they were going to be swamped by something which would become or be in effect the manual approach. And quickly, people like myself were told, please do not submit these forms to the regulator. We'll be launching our online system for registration. And so in effect, the opportunity to submit a form by email was terminated almost as quickly as it was. There was then an announcement that the registration system will be up and running on the 1st of May. It took a little time to get that going. And by the 16th, around 17th of May, for a couple of days, there was a window. Then suddenly the system was taken offline. The regulator announced that they were having some technical problems. But by the time that we're having this webinar, it seems as though those problems have been overcome. You can at least register your information off, and you must register your information officer online. And those of you who've been looking into the legislation in more detail will recognize that you can appoint a deputy or multiple deputies, and those too can be registered online. I registered successfully on the 17th of May, and I got my registration certificate, and I found the process easy to complete, but there are some challenges. I'm not sure if they've amended this, but the registration process required that you have a landline number, which in this mobile world is something that maybe comes as a little surprise, but you do need to go to the registration system and look at all of the unique requirements. For whatever reason, the regulator is asking for your gender. The regulator is now asking for your ID number. And some of this information is being used to exclude certain circumstances. If, for example, you've registered once as an information officer for one institution for which you're responsible, it's entirely possible you might be the CEO for more than one institution. You can actually only register once because they do a check against your ID number. Some of those, I don't know if they're glitches or they're design features, but some of those still need to be addressed at the time of this webinar anyway, to make sure that that whole information officer registration process runs smoothly. And as it's an annually renewable activity, then this is something that is clearly going to be around for some time. And I'm sure the information regulator and the team trying to make sure that that process is just as smooth as possible. Now, one of the things, of course, is a headline grabber is, well, what happens if I don't comply with the POPIA Act? And these look like big numbers. Maybe they are, but at 10 million Rand for a large organization, a big financial institution, some of our big banks and mobile service providers, 10 million is a relatively small number compared to some of the fines that they've been incurring over the last couple of years for non-compliance with other legislation, such as anti-money laundering. A very small organization, as may be the case for many of you taking part in the webinar today, that's a huge amount of money, which could be the size of the fine levied for just one incident. Now, the expectation is that the regulator is going to use carefully their powers, and if it's anything like we've seen in other countries, be helpful and be giving advice and guidance in the early days. But if there are cases of blatant disregard for legislation, And we're talking here about large organizations who, if you like, are thumbing their views to the regulator, then it's not to be excluded that there might be some heavy fines for non-compliance or heavy administrative fines for non-compliance that are going to grab the headlines. We're sitting here on the 2nd of June, and within the next 30 days, no doubt the regulator is getting ready to grab some of those headlines. But I think, to be honest, that the approach of the regulator is much more helpful and friendly, and much more taking an educational approach than saying we're going to come after you with a really big stick from day one. Of course, that's the maximum. There may be lower levels of fines used to provide some sort of incentive for organizations to pay attention and to comply. But the truth is that there are lots of other things we have to worry about and fine. That includes the damage to our reputation, the disruption of our business, loss of confidence with our customers. And if we look at international experience where you've had a big incident, I'm thinking particularly about one of the cell phone operators in the UK just a couple of years ago, they spent 60 times as much on a marketing campaign to try and recover their reputation than the fine they received from the regulator. So it may well be, however great the fine is from the regulator, that there's a lot more that we need to think about in terms of the impact on the business rather than just the. So I mentioned a little earlier that the Promotion of Access to Information Act and the POPIA Act, or Protection of Personal Information, which is an approach to how we work rather than just the legislation itself, and these work closely together. We actually need to understand both pieces of legislation. And when I mentioned that the POPIA Act came into force last year, there was actually an exception to that blanket statement. And that was that at the time the legislation was first being drawn up, it was envisaged that the responsibilities of the South African Human Rights Commission or management and enforcement of the POPIA legislation would move across to the information regulator. Whatever reason, that move did not happen in July last year, 2020. It was announced that that final transition, final piece of the jigsaw would fall into place this year. And what we've seen in the last few weeks is that the information regulator has issued new draft regulations on the approach to help bring a POPIA Act and POPIA more closely together. That means that we really have to understand both pieces of legislation. The POPIA Act on its own is only one part of the balance between what is the scales of justice. We need to think about controlling access and granting access. So number 9, getting compliant actually is only the start. This is a permanent long-term commitment. We need to be able to demonstrate not only through our framework, but through other actions that we're taking, that we have a sustainable environment. And many of the clients that I'm working with who've been receiving letters from their clients saying, what can you do to demonstrate your compliance, compliant now and you're going to be compliant in the future, has that emphasis on compliance on an ongoing basis. So POPIA is not just a question of having a project and saying, wow, that was done. It's about sustaining compliance and having the evidence that we're sustaining compliance on a long-term basis. So of all the other things that you need to know about POPIA, it's the fact that all the international surveys say that if there's an opportunity of non-compliance with privacy legislation, whether it's in the EU or anywhere else around the world, including South Africa, one of the most important aspects is staff awareness. One of the responsibilities of the information officer outlined in both the POPIA legislation, in the Act and in the regulations, is the importance of creating staff awareness for compliance with the POPIA Act. And if we miss the boat on that, if we drop the ball on getting our staff aware, then we're going to have trouble, because the surveys say 80+% of the damage done in terms of non-compliance is from within. Although there may be, I think they're called bad actors, state actors out there, or the individuals who are going to hit us with a ransomware attack or some other type of cyber attack are a reality, and they may well represent a threat to us. The biggest threat we have is our own staff. And in that context, we need to ensure that our staff are well aware of what their responsibilities are, and hence the focus on staff training as one of the most important aspects of. So we've been through the what do we need to know. Now the question is, what do we need to do about it? Well, again, fairly straightforward, 10 points. Number one, make sure you have ownership in the organization. Number one in the POPIA is about accountability. But look at condition number one, and it doesn't mention the name or the job role of the information officer. It talks about having ownership in the organization. What that really means is at all levels. If you're still in the stage where you're putting a project together to complete your POPIA activities, make sure that you have broad coverage in your organization. Get a steering committee together, get a task team together, and make sure that you have the message spread widely in the business that this is not about the information officer, CEO, or somebody they nominate in their place. It's about all of us. We must have joint ownership in the organization. Number two, we always recommend to our clients to take a formal project approach to not only increase the chance of success because of the benefit that a project approach can bring, but it's a real opportunity to build up the evidence that your organization has been working towards compliance if and when the regulator, the auditor, the press, or investors, or whoever else wants to come and ask the question. Really good to have a project charter, talk about the scope of what we're trying to do, the timescale involved, all those other issues. We recommend using a project. Number three, I've just mentioned how broadly across the business you need to look to see who's going to get involved as part of a multifunctional team, but then to get that team to jointly identify what are the impact and risk areas that exist in the business, and then ensure that those are adequately addressed. I mentioned that condition number 7 says that we need to complete a risk assessment, all reasonably foreseeable risks, and the regulations say we need to do an impact assessment. Put those together, and it gives you what in effect is the scope of work for your POPI compliance activity. Number 4, I mentioned to you that there's a requirement for a compliance framework, so get to grips with that early on and help to build your efforts towards compliance around the framework that you've chosen. That framework is going to be so important in you explaining not only to the regulator, but to your other stakeholders, and particularly your customers, who are likely to be writing to you soon if they haven't already, to say, how can you demonstrate to me, your customer, that you are compliant in terms of the POPI Act? And the answer is, well, if you have a strong compliance framework defined, then you can work towards that. 5, we've said that you need to identify the impact and risk areas. Well, now you need to get out there and complete some formal assessments, document the results, and then tie whatever you discovered in your investigation phase to your risk appetite. The POPI Act says that we must do what is reasonable and appropriate, and organizational and technical in terms of addressing risks. And hence, if we apply our risk appetite, which says that we can live with and that we must fix straight away, it'll give you a little bit of a roadmap as to where you go with your remediation. Point 6, implement the remedial actions that were identified in the risk assessment phase. Sometimes we see projects where people say, yeah, great, I've identified all my risk, and then sort of the wheels fall off. We've got to have the momentum. We've got to have the energy to keep going and make sure that those remedial actions get addressed, and go back then and review whether or not we're comfortable in line with our risk appetite that we've done everything we need to. Be realistic about what can be done right now, phase 1, and I would say phase 1 is up to the 1st of July. Haven't got a long way with your POPI project so far, then prioritize. Look at the things that are going to be clear indicators that you care and you're doing the right thing. What might those be? Example, make sure you have a privacy notice on your website. Make sure that you have a privacy notice addressing your staff and what they need to know, because they're an important stakeholder group. Make sure your PIA manual is up on your website. And then have a look at the things you'll only probably, given the amount of time left now, be able to get to at a later phase. I can't emphasize enough staff training. And I must say that it varies by role and seniority. And some of the people I've been talking to over the last few weeks have been quite shocked that the guidance note from the information regulator published in April highlighted 41 duties and responsibilities of the information officer, or IO, and even if they're assisted by a deputy, that's a pretty tall task list to climb in a relatively short period. It's all very well giving staff awareness in general, what is the POPIA Act, how I think you should address it at an operational level. You need that as well in more senior positions or in more specialist positions in the organization. What else I think you need to do is tell people what you're doing, build the confidence that can come from the success associated with being POPI compliant. Some of you may have read articles in recent days which are highlighting the opportunities that present themselves if we get our act together and we demonstrate to our customers, our suppliers, and our staff what we build the confidence. And what we want to do, or hopefully we agree, is as a country, we want to get to the point where we can be seen as a trusted trading partner, in particular, not only, but in particular when it comes to the European Union, as we've seen other countries that we're following, in particular Mauritius, we hear only the other day, and other places around the world that have received what's called an adequacy decision, which says that the European Union deemed the country as a whole to be a safe place to do business with from a data protection perspective. So the more we build up the impression amongst our stakeholders and then the international community that we are serious about data protection, the better it will be. And the last thing we need to do is not treat this as a one-off activity, treat this as something which is substantial in terms of what we need to do in the long term, and make sure we have an ongoing compliance plan in place. And then we're going to feel we've really made an achievement. We've achieved something. So that's the presentation from my side. What I'd like to suggest is that as hopefully you've been submitting your questions via the chat, you continue to do so as we move into the Q&A session. And this will be your opportunity to participate in the webinar. I'm going to sign off from the formal component of the presentation. I'd just like to thank the team that helped to put this event together, and also the large number of people who've participated so far in listening and hopefully now taking part in the rest of this. So thank you very much, and good luck if you are still working on your POPI Act and PIA compliance project. I wish you every success, certainly in the next 30 days as we come to the countdown to full enforcement powers for the regulator. So the last message, if you like, from the sponsors is, if you have any inquiries, please talk to MediaWorks. My partner John and I have been working with MediaWorks over several years. They've put together a fantastic opportunity for you to learn online. And since we've had COVID and some of the lockdown restrictions in place, it's become the obvious way to learn about POPI and what we need to do as individuals to comply with POPI requirements. And yeah, the team at MediaWorks be happy to talk to you. Thank you again, and that's it from me.